David Hume is one of the giants of Western philosophy. He was a man of the 18th century of the Enlightenment, and during his day he was seen as a very dangerous and radical figure. Since his death, he has come to be vastly influential, leading to an extraordinary number of projects by other philosophers who have investigated questions or problems that he raised. And he has also, the way he has formulated philosophy and done it has also been very influential in terms of method. As a background to Hume, it's important to recognize that during his time there was a long-standing dispute between two different schools of thought about where human knowledge comes from: rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism is associated with thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And very summarily, it is associated with the following characteristics. So the belief that it is possible to obtain a knowledge of what exists by reason alone, the belief that all knowledge forms a single system that is deductive in character, and the belief that everything is explicable and can in principle be brought under this single system. By contrast, empiricism is Hume's view. It's associated with figures especially in the English-speaking world, including John Locke and George Berkeley. And it's usually understood as the idea that knowledge of matters of fact have their origins in our experience of the world. So we don't have any knowledge of matters of fact that doesn't originate in our experiences. Experience then is the great guide for empiricists to the formation of the mind. David Hume himself was from Scotland. He is generally associated with a few others as a British empiricist. He was not only a philosopher but also a historian, and he wrote a magnificent and really voluminous history of England that was very influential in his day. Some of his philosophical works were not as influential in his lifetime, but later on they had perhaps a more lasting impact than his history. He wrote about epistemology. He wrote about ethics. He wrote about political economy. He also wrote about philosophy of religion in his dialogues concerning natural religion. In the Inquiry, we find Hume engaging in a very subtle and intricate investigation of the mind and its operations. And one thing that he seems very intent on doing is classifying some of the different operations of the mind to try to determine what they are and how they function. So the thoughts of the mind he divides into two: ideas and impressions. Impressions, one can think of them as just immediate sensory perceptions or internal feelings of things. So the vivid experience that you're having right now of your immediate surroundings, whether in a room or sitting in a chair, perhaps standing up, this is a composition of a series of impressions. Ideas are derivative from impressions. They are copies of impressions. So Hume has a couple of arguments for this. It's important to explore these arguments in the text. But Hume thinks that ideas are faint and obscure and mere copies or derivative conceptions of our impressions. Impressions are strong and vivid. Ideas or thoughts arise after impressions. They can mix and match among impressions, and they serve as memories. Impressions are the basis for them, though. For Hume, the mind has certain regularized kinds of operations, and again, he's trying to classify the nature of those operations in the inquiry. Among its operations are resemblance, contiguity in time or place, and cause and effect. So if you have one thought and then you have another thought that enters your mind, chances are it has arisen as a result of resemblance or contiguity or cause and effect in some sort of a connection to the original thought that you had. Hume offers in the inquiry a very famous division of the operations of the mind into two. So relations of ideas and matters of fact are the two categories that he develops. This is known as Hume's fork. Relations of ideas are pretty intuitive. These are things that are certain demonstratively. They do not require reference to anything in the actual world in order to be understood or in order to be demonstrated to be true. They are correct and can be demonstrated to be true by the mere operation of our thought, apart from the world itself. Some examples of this are things like geometrical, algebraic, arithmetic equations and relations. The Pythagorean theorem is an example of this. The denial of things such as these is a contradiction. Another example of a relation of ideas might be a definitional relation of ideas. So a bachelor is an unmarried man. Suppose I said that sentence. That sentence would be true by definition, since a bachelor by definition is an unmarried man. And it's not a sentence whose truth requires reference to anything in the world in order to be confirmed as correct. In contrast to relations of ideas, Hume also offers another category, matters of fact. Matters of fact depend for their existence, for the evidence for their correctness, for their truth, upon things that are in the world. So it is not sufficient to say that, for a matter of fact, to say that it is true as such. It must be true by virtue of its relation to something in the world obtained via experience or encountered via experience. Okay, so suppose I said it's raining today. This is a matter of fact. It is a thought, the assertion of which requires for its truth an encounter with the world. One would need to go outside and inspect the world in order to determine whether it's actually raining. So Hume is very intrigued by matters of fact, and he thinks that their dependence upon experience renders them rather precarious and subject to unfortunate manipulations. Okay, so he famously says that all evidence or reasoning for matters of fact seems to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. The cause and effect relation seems to be essential to our ability to process matters of fact. And it is typical when we encounter the world for us to use that cause and effect relation as a way of carving the world up. So Hume famously will use examples drawn from the actual world in efforts to explode our belief that the cause and effect relation is in the things themselves in the world. So Hume devotes a very large amount of time in the inquiry to investigating the cause and effect relation. So he says our knowledge of cause and effect is not an a priori knowledge, that is, it does not precede experience, but rather it is derived from experience. It follows after experience. So famously, if you, he uses the example of billiards, and if you think of a pool table, the party game, and if you look at someone, say, wielding the cue stick and preparing to strike the cue ball, if that person strikes the cue ball, aiming it towards the 8 ball, and the cue ball then strikes the 8 ball, you know from experience that the 8 ball will then move. Perhaps it will move toward the corner pocket like the person intended, or perhaps it won't, but it will move in response to the cue ball. Now, that thought in your mind that the 8 ball will move after being struck by the cue ball is something that you believe is a representation of a real relation. Most unreflective persons just think naturally that the cue ball is causing the 8 ball to move. But in fact, actually what has happened, Hume argues, is you have in your experiences sensorially encountered two events which are serially related in a temporal train. Event 1, the cue ball has struck the 8 ball. Event 2, the 8 ball has moved. Perhaps the cue ball has caused the 8 ball to move, but that is not something that you actually can see causally. You cannot see the cue ball making the 8 ball move. Hume says it's always a mystery to us. All that you can see, because of your sensory limitations, is the cue ball striking the 8 ball, event 1, and event 2, the 8 ball moving. The mind makes a leap. It adds the cause and effect relation. The senses, all that they deliver to the mind, is merely the sensorial experiences of the cue ball striking the 8 ball as event 1 and the 8 ball moving as event 2. The supposition of some causal necessity, the cue ball making the 8 ball move, some tire connection between cause and effect, is in Hume's words an arbitrary thing. It's an addition that the mind makes. It's not something that you can actually find in the things themselves out there in the world. So this seems to suggest that we have inherent limitations in our minds, that it's not possible for us actually to encounter in the world itself causal necessity. All that it suggests that we can encounter are serially related events. And this is very disturbing as a thought or an exploration of what it is that we're doing when we encounter the world, and what it is that scientists are doing when scientists attempt to carve the world up and understand it. Hume says that, in fact, actually, what we should define causality as in the world is as a constant conjunction. So our experience of cause and effect is not an experience of something that is actually out there in the world. It's a mental relation that our minds have added to our encounters with the world. What's out there in the world actually is, at least per our experiences of it, just a constant and regular conjunction of events. We can't see the secret powers that guarantee that certain effects will follow from particular causes, but we can encounter the regular conjunction or habitual experience of certain effects following certain causes, or certain, more accurately, certain events following upon other events. These philosophical reflections lead to some very difficult results, very troubling results. So one of the most troubling of them is that induction appears to be based on fallacious thinking, or at the very least very troubling thinking. So induction is a process whereby thinkers, usually scientists, assemble particular data forms and derive general conclusions from those particular data forms. But in order to derive those general conclusions, they have to assume certain things about the future, especially certain things about that which has not yet been seen, but that which they are trying to predict. So consider the following premises and conclusion. All forms of probable or inductive reasoning assume the hidden premise that the future will continue to be like the past. If the future will not be like the past, our past experiences are not a reliable guide to what our future experiences will be. But if we ask, why should the future be like the past, then we can only reflect that in the past the future was like the past, so in the future it will probably be so as well. But this inference assumes the hidden premise that the future will be like the past, so our justification is circular. Therefore, while we cannot avoid forming beliefs about the future on the basis of past experience, we have no logical or reasoned basis for thinking those beliefs are true. So inductive forms of reasoning then are not based on sound principles, but mere inferential understandings that are unjustifiable. The basis for our life, for Hume, ultimately, the basis for regularity and for our expectations about the world is not a basis of causal necessity. There's nothing in the world to guarantee that the future will be like the past. There's nothing in the world to guarantee that certain events that we've always seen associated with each other are causally related. All that we can rely upon is custom or habit. So our common life is based upon custom and not reason. Habit is the cause or reason that the repetition of any act or the conjunction of two events that we label cause and effect have the propensity to produce in us the belief that such repetitions and associations will continue. So there is nothing inherent in the world itself that guarantees the regularity of our future lives, but custom is the guide of human life, which we rely upon inferentially to believe that that is the case. This is a very troubling kind of thought philosophically, and it served as the basis for some other extraordinary philosophical meditations by later philosophers, including most famously another philosopher later in the 18th century, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, who said that David Hume's skeptical reflections had awoken him from his dogmatic slumber about the way the world was and the nature of philosophy.